It's working. Oh. Good morning, dear colleagues and friends. My warmest welcome to all of you, to the speakers and to the whole of the auditory, to this Tuesday morning session. We are still in the second session on the topic of social mobility, economic growth, and economic inequality. We will have 3 papers. And the session will be organized that we first have all the 3 papers, then a coffee break, and after the break, our discussion as usual. The first paper is of David Carvajal De La Vega, Hilario Casado Alonso, and Vanesa Abarca Abarca about economic inequality, social mobility, and political tensions in Castile in the 15th and 16th centuries. It's your floor, David.
Thank you. Prima di tutto vorrei ringraziare.
First and foremost, I'd like to thank the Foundation for mentioning this contribution, my paper, economic inequality, etc.
Centuries. Well, what we intend in this presentation is to analyze how a society was able to offer opportunities for social climbing, just in the case of the famous banker Simon Reith, although we can't forget phenomena such as poverty, very present in the 17th century Spanish painting. To do that, this research is a small part of a larger project in which we have a very general objective: study the evolution of inequality and social mobility in different regions, in different parts of the Crown of Castile, its consequences, its causes, in a period of expansion and a period of crisis, in a period of deep political and social changes. But in this presentation, we have a more specific goal. Is the analysis focus in a special part of Castile, in the surroundings of the Duero Valley, in a group of representative medium-sized villages. And of course, to do that, we will focus our interest in social mobility understood from different points of view, understood from the wealth point of view, from the privilege, and from the access to the political power. Well, to be brief with the context, between the mid-15th century and the 16th century. This period was a period of important political changes, from the political division of Castile and the Iberian Peninsula and the conquest of the Muslim territories in the south of Castile to the empire and the Spanish monarchy. It was a moment of intense economic growth in terms of demography, in terms of production, domestic trade, etc. And it was a time of crisis since the late 16th century. And of course, it was a moment of important and deep social changes with new noble houses, new privileged groups, the rise of urban elites, etc. And of course, social and political conflicts, as we will see later. Well, the region that we are studying in depth is the Duero Valley, more or less is this part of Castile. In the center is the river Duero, for that reason the Duero Valley. And why the Duero Valley is one of the main regions in this moment? Well, just check what happened in 1530s in the Duero Valley. More or less, the Duero Valley represented the 40% of the Castilian population and 1/3 of today's Spain, so it's important in terms of demography, with 1.5 million inhabitants, 1.8 60 years later. In this region, we can find a dense and crowded urban network with 14, 15 inhabitants per square kilometer, comparable with another northern areas in Europe or northern Italy. And a very interesting fact, this region represented 63% of the ordinary revenues of the royal treasury. So it was a very dynamic economic region. And we are working with small size villages. What is in Castile a small, medium-sized village? Well, a village with 1,000, 4,000 inhabitants. We are working now in the Duero Valley in these small villages with the yellow cross. But in our project, we are collecting data from other spaces, from other villages in the northern of Castile, in the area of La Rioja, or in the central part of Castile, the area in the surroundings of Madrid, Sigüenza, etc., etc. Well, and sources, in this case, in our case, is a challenge for us. We cannot compare our sources with the sources that we have seen yesterday from local archives, etc. Sources in general, this topic is a challenge for us because the scarcity of sources in Castile for the study of social mobility and inequality. Anyway, we have a delay. Well, anyway, we try to work with sources with homogeneous data in terms of names and surnames, on wealth and income, and we try to work with sources on the short, medium, and long term. To do that, to the study of inequality, we used to check and research on different sources like padrones, repartimientos, Tazmia's books, and to the study of social mobility, we use more or less the same sources, another like council minutes books. About the padrones, well, again, it's a fiscal source, so we are connecting with the previous session when our colleagues talk about the importance of this kind of sources. Well, in Castile, the main sources in terms of taxation were the padrones. The padrones are lists of contributors for the payment of an extraordinary tax, in this case, the servicio. The servicio was a common tax for all the crown of Castile. It was common in the south, in the north, etc. It was an extraordinary tax to be paid to the king. An extraordinary tax during the 16th century, it was more ordinary than extraordinary, but anyways, an extraordinary tax. And these padrones, this list of contributors, were useful for the payment of local taxes too, or for the payment of extraordinary local expenses, for the bill of a bridge or repair a wall. In these padrones, we find this amount payable, an estimation according to household wealth, taking into account movable and unmovable property, both. And these padrones, this list, could contain information about the size and composition of some privileged groups, like the hidalgos, the low nobility in Castile, because they were exempted. So they recorded in the padron because they were exempted to control who has to pay and who were exempted for the payment. Thanks to these padrones, we can study inequality and we can study social mobility. We try to study social mobility because we can find information on the persistence of families in a village over time and their position determined by wealth. And these sources allow us to study the arrival of new families or upward movements, etc. Of course, we discussed about it yesterday, but of course, the fiscal sources have problems. Of course, we know it, and we are we know it perfectly. Sometimes do not include data on wealth, or sometimes do not include data on some privilege, like nobility or this low nobility. Sometimes do not include data on poor people. Sometimes the households, the families, the head of the family may hide assets. Anyway, is the best source that we have to study these both topics. This is an example about a padron. This is quite similar to other lists of contributors with the name, the surname, the amount, the payable amount. And sometimes we have information about the neighborhood. Sometimes we have information about the job. Between the 10–20% of the references gave information about the job. This is an example about a padrón in 1527 in the village of Olmedo. Well, very quickly, another two sources, the Tasmias books. This is a very interesting source, but very scarce. These books is a very well-known source that contain information about the tithes paid in every parish, the 10% of the grain produced. And this is interesting because a few years ago, Carlos Santiago Caballero from Madrid wrote a paper on inequality in 18th century Spain using these Tasmias books. It's interesting because we can study inequality from the income point of view. It's different than wealth. And finally, the Council's minute books is interesting, and again, we connect with the previous session when our colleagues talk about the importance of local councils, members, or being member of the local council. Thanks to these Council's minutes books, we can know the composition and the changes in these urban oligarchies. We know the new members, all members, the election of officials, etc. It's another way to study social mobility in terms of the access to the local power and the local government. Well, what do we know about inequality in northern Castile and the Duero Valley? Well, what we know is a drop. I want to show you a previous work by Carlos Álvarez and Leandro Prados. It's a very famous article, The Rise and Fall of Spain, long-run vision on Spain. Well, this is a first attempt using the reconstruction of the Williamson Index. And, well, the first part, or the left part of the graph, fits well with our trends, with our previous data, but not the second part, the right part of the graph. But anyway, what we know in the Duero Valley and northern Castile is this. Wait. Okay, well. What we know in the Duero Valley, this is a very general trend, is that inequality increased during this moment, during the 15th and 16th century, a moment, just remember, a moment of intense economic growth. Well, we can define three different stages during this century and a half. The first part, the mid-15th century and the early 16th century, with a slight increase, a slow increase of inequality that slowed down in the first part of the 16th century, a moment of special political instability, the death of the Queen Isabella, changes in terms of institutions, and of course, the great revolt in the early modern era in Castile, Las Comunidades, the Comunidades in 1521. The second stage presents an important increase in terms of inequality in the northern region, especially in the Duero Valley, with Gini's that moved from 0.4 to 0.6. It's a little bit different than other data in this time in other parts of Europe, but we can observe an increase in inequality very well connected with this strong and intense economic growth in all terms. And a third stage between the late mid-16th century and the mid-17th century. This is a very interesting time because in the north of Castile, northern Castile, the crisis had a very strong impact, mostly in the Duero Valley, with a clear exception, Madrid, and the surroundings of Madrid. It could be explained because Madrid hosted the court since the late 16th century, and here the crisis was less strong, less severe, and inequality was constant. Well, and of course, inequality in the Duero Valley made possible generalized enrichment of the people, but some did more than others, causing a growing inequality. Some reasons that could explain this growing inequality are very well connected with this intense economic growth in all terms. The demographic growth was amazing in the 16th century, the territorial expansion, the increasing craft and agricultural production, the producers get richer and richer, the growth of domestic consumption and foreign trade, for example, the great merchants, we will see an example later, that were rich and richer. The proliferation of markets and fairs for the supply of food, goods, etc., the development of financial markets, the development of institutions. For example, it's very interesting to check how new noble houses create their own states with their officials, etc. Well, it was a moment of opportunities for the Castilians, for different parts of the society. And who were the Castilians that increased their wealth? Well, obviously merchants, money changers, bankers, officials, new urban elites. These merchants, bankers, producers, etc., were holders of large properties. They invested high amount of money in unmovable properties. They invested a lot of money in public debt, in the famous juros, and they invested in their wealth in other assets. It was the rise of new social groups in the early 16th century and all the 16th century. And what we know is that upward mobility worked well in the 16th century, but when it did not, social and political conflicts escalated, like in the Comunidades conflict in 1521 and other cases, like the confrontation between the local representatives in the Cortes with the king, with Philip II is the best example. Well, on social mobility, interesting because Spanish historiography has been focused in the study of social mobility, understanding this phenomenon as the access to one of these groups, if we see, the access of one of these groups. We distinguish between the privileged groups and non-privileged groups, but anyway, all these groups, the members of these groups were members of the Castilian elite. So it is very well known, the access to the nobility with the new titles, the access to the military orders in the 17th century, mostly. It was very important mechanism to be a part of the Castilian elite, to be a part of the access to the low nobility, the hidalgos. Now we will see an example. And it's interesting, the access to other groups, non-privileged groups, like officials, local representatives, and in general, economic and social elites. And how Castilians joined these groups? Well, the mechanisms are very well known: royal grants and privileges, the purchase of titles, for example, the purchase of seat in the city council. It was a very well-known case, in the case of Madrid and other councils. Marriage strategies and education. In the case of officials, education and higher education was very important. In Valladolid, Salamanca, Alcalá de Henares, the universities provided with a very good education on laws, etc., to be a part of these king's officials and council's officials. But well, all these mechanisms were very diverse, but supporting all these mechanisms, or most of this mechanism, we find wealth. So wealth was a key question to understand how some groups could purchase a title, could purchase a seat in the local council, etc. So we will focus our analysis today in these two cases: the access to the low nobility, the hidalgos, and social climbing in terms of wealth. And the first example is Castrojeriz.
Je parle de Castrojeriz.
I'm going to speak of the city. That's this town, middle size, in the St. James Walk. The yellow line, that's the St. James Walk. That's a senior city, depending on the Castro count. And now we have 13 patrones, estimate, from 1448 up to 1563. But we have 9 tax registers from the rural nobles, their wealth has been assessed to pay municipal taxes. Noblemen, the nobility, represented almost, hidalgos represented almost, 7% of the population of the city. But above all, after a few years, we can compare the wealth of the nobles, not important nobles, with the rest of the population.
Noi possiamo fare le percentuali del nord.
And able to calculate the percentage of the hidalgos according to the level of wealth. So the petty nobility was almost 20% of the richest population layers. But the nobles were also 7% of the 20% of the poorest ranks of the city. We got rich nobles, but also we got poor nobles. The case of Ihote in the 16th century. So as a consequence, nobles they didn't obtain the entire wealth of the city. Altogether, their wealth, the richest one, were merchants, notaries, and clerics.
Chi sono gli hidalgo?
Who are the hidalgos? Hidalgos, the social composition of petty nobility, were two groups of hidalgo in the village. The old hidalgos related to military function officers, but also we got new hidalgos, mainly merchants. Trade, international trade and wealth as the main driver to social mobility access. So, this was the international trade for families of merchants in the Iberian Peninsula. These are families which can be found in the Low Countries in Italy and France, and also in the UK. And these allowed access to the nobility, and it drove the increase of inequality in the village. It generated manifestation of social privilege, noble lifestyle, religious foundations, etc. Funeral chapels, knights, brotherhoods, etc.
Due famiglie.
Two families. We have the Gaio family. We do not know its origin of this family, unfortunately. Maybe it came from another part of Castile. And she reached the city at the beginning of the 15th century, the 16th century, sorry. Maybe this family was present in Antwerp or Low Countries. We can see the chapel now, with these paintings on the walls. And we see some portraits in the cavalry book. Another example of a Hidalgo family. That's the Castro Mojica family, coming from the northern part of Castile, that reaches Burgos at the mid-15th century, and another branch of the family, Sir Rich Castro Queriz, with his family funeral chapel, with graves of the first generation, the second generation of the family, and even afterwards. And in this villa, you see the grave of the third generation, Hidalgos, the richest Hidalgos, ruling the city, having seats in the municipal, power council, and this showing the upward social mobility through international trade through merchants. We speak of the city of Burgos, very similar, with more, numerous examples to share.
The village of Olmedo in the south of the province of Valladolid. Well, and just let me show you a nice story about this village. In 1625, the famous Spanish writer, one of the main authors of the Spanish Golden Age of theater, Lope de Vega, wrote a theater play, El Caballero de Olmedo, the nobleman from Olmedo. Well, this text, wrote in the 17th century, relates the murder of a noble from Olmedo after attending the Medina del Campo fairs and after attending a bullfight. The most interesting in this story that Lope de Vega wrote in the 17th century is that this event refers to an event that took place 100 years before, in 1521, the death of the nobleman Juan Vivero. Well, my reflection on this example is that this text, this story remained in Castilians 100 years later, and the most interesting is that this text is framed in a time of social and economic prosperity with festivities, fairs, etc., but also in a moment of conflicts, minor conflicts in a changing society. It's a good example about what was happening in the 16th century. Well, what we know about inequality and social mobility in Olmedo, we know that the trends more or less matches well with the trends observed in the northern Castile and the Duero Valley, with an increasing inequality till the 1520s. It's a moment that matches with the communities, with las comunidades, with this revolt, a moment of high social mobility, with new members in the local elite, changing positions, etc. Well, this is an example about how different families moved between the 22 richest households in Olmedo. The two most interesting periods were this 1504, 1527, 1540s, 1580s, with new families or families that fall off the list from the previous moment. Well, just to check this, to finish the presentation, this family Iscar in yellow, you can see, or the family Carrasco in light blue. If we check, if we find in the notarial records in Medina del Campo, it's very easy to find information about members of these families, buying on credit, doing business, etc., etc. Okay, so it is very well related with this moment. And just to finish, as final remarks, well, in the 15th, 16th century, this period of economic growth, it was a period of economic growth and increasing inequality in northern Castile and the Duero Valley. In this period, or during this period, processes for upward mobility, social mobility, are observed as a consequence of this economic growth. In particular, because of the enrichment of some social groups, like merchants, bankers, the access to noble and privileged groups, like the case of the Hidalgos in Castrojeriz and other places, the access to political power and institutions, local councils. In the text, you can find information about the example of Valladolid, and the high geographical mobility. And upward social mobility was closely linked to the episodes of political and social tension and unrest. In times of Henry IV and Isabella, the new political local elite were related with political and social unrest. In times of the Emperor Charles V, Las Comunidades was the Great Revolt. It's a movement between the elites and against the king and some officials. And in times of Philip II, the situation changed a little bit because of this entente between the king and the new elites. Although there were new tensions in the 60s and 70s with the negotiation of new payments. Well, and we conclude with this paint about the execution of the comuneros of Castilla in 1521. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, David and Hilario, for your inspiring contribution. And now we move to the eastern part of Central Europe, into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Our colleague from Groningen, Mikolaj Malinowski, will speak about incredible commitment, influence, accumulation, consensus making, and the collapse of the Commonwealth. Please, it's your floor.
How do I turn it on? Okay, it's on, perfect. Thank you very much for inviting me here and giving me the opportunity to present my work. It is a project I've been working on for a while, and I had just good news with explorations in economic history that they're interested in, after some revisions, maybe publishing it. And there's also a book contract with Princeton University Press for developing this into a book. So anything you're interested into this story, I would like to hear more, that should be discussed in the book. I'm really interested in what do you want to know, what's the, what people think it's interesting about Polish-Lithuanian economic history. So if I can see it from here, basically, if we look at the, in a nutshell, literature about why are some countries rich and other poor, and especially in the early modern period, one of the very important ideas is that the North Sea region, England, the Netherlands, really pulled ahead because of their political institutions. They had parliamentary institutions, parliament, states general, that constrained the executive, limited the authority of the king, and because of this, there were secure property rights, and capitalism could basically develop. One of the ways to measure this empirically, developed by Jan van Zad and collaborators, was basically looking at how much parliaments were in session, the idea being if they were in session, they could enforce pressure on the king and protect everyone from the predation by this extractive ruler. The question here is that one of the countries that actually failed in the early modern period and even disappeared in the 18th century was the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, who in a way did exactly what the literature tells it to do. It limited the authority of the king, and instead of developing very strong capitalistic market economy, well, it failed. So what happened? And here you can see on this graph the comparison to how often Polish-Lithuanian parliament Sejm was in session in black versus the British parliament in gray. And you can see that especially in the 18th century, those sessions are becoming very short and infrequent because of the use of the veto in the Polish-Lithuanian parliament. And basically, I want to explain why this veto was used. So the key messages here is that I'm going to argue that inequality of influence, so concentration of political power, undermines the elite's ability to commit credibly to political contract and reach consensus. Basically, if we have a parliamentary system that relies on unanimity, we need to be able to trust each other. What I'm arguing is, if at some point some of us become so influential and so powerful, we stop trusting those people and they are unable to credibly commit to collaboration. Without trust, there can be no consensus. That's the idea. So this may lead to state failure. And here, typically we think of those strong kings as something that can hinder political process, but from this perspective, we can see them as a powerful third-party enforcers, someone that creates trust in a political system because it's someone that can constrain those overly powerful individuals. And I argue that this is basically about parliaments and kings not necessarily only opposing each other, but they can also complement each other. The kings constrain the most powerful members of the elite, and in return, the parliaments constrain the king. And we have the whole system of checks and balances. And I use Poland-Lithuania as a case study to document all of this. Why it's an interesting case study? Well, first, it required unanimity of parliamentary decisions, so it fits very nicely with we want to understand what creates consensus. Second, it had weak and limited ruler. Third, there was an influence concentration with an elite within the elite, so the rise of the oligarchs, I will show you. And all of this together, I argue, contributed to the parliamentary gridlock and state failure in the 18th century. So, in order for the parliament in order for any exchange to happen, and we can think of contracts between members of the parliament as forms of like a political exchange, you need to have be able to make a credible commitment so that when I say I'm going to do something, you can trust me that I'm going to do this. And there's 3 different ways discussed in the literature that this enforcement of contracts can happen. So one of the first ones is, and I know because once I discussed this with Guido Alfani, and he told me that this is a very dodgy bit of literature. There's this idea of Avner Greif and a paper from 1994 about Podesta and Genoa and how there was a conflict between oligarchs and a representative of the emperor stepped in, Podesta, to sort them out to prevent civil war. So this is one of the ideas. You need this powerful third-party enforcement by someone who can basically put all those oligarchs in line, someone more powerful than the oligarchs, basically. The second is credible self-restraint, and this is the classic argument why a glorious revolution in Britain was so successful and why democracies are so successful. Basically, that first the states and executive build some kind of power and capacity, and then credibly self-restrained by putting up a constitution. So this is very much about, this has been most recently discussed very thoroughly by Acemoglu and Robinson in their book about narrow corridor and the Goldilocks state, when you have exactly this balance between power concentration by the government and limitations by the parliament, and they trust each other because they signed a document that they all believe in, basically. That's, this is the fundament of our political system now, so intuitively understand what it's about, right? But there's also a third enforcement mechanism that's relevant to our case study, because in Poland, Lithuania, there was no third-party enforcement by king, and there was no constitution in the modern sense that limited the authority of everyone, of the powerful members of the elite. So we need a different enforcement strategy. Here I am building on the theory of the natural state from the book Violence and Social Orders by Douglas North and collaborators, where the idea is, it's early modern state. There's no universal franchise, not everyone is a citizen and part of the political process. Instead of this, we have the elite, so we have the nobility, and they have the political rights. So basically, they form a coalition of power that captures state institutions. And this is what a natural state is. Those members of this coalition of power create rules to their benefits, right? And they distribute rents. For example, only they can have serfs. And they use the coercive power of the state to enforce serfdom that they benefit from, right? So the state exists to create benefits for the ruling elite, like, for example, serfdom. Okay. So basically, the third enforcement mechanism, and that's the one that Poland and Lithuania relied on, I argue, was this credible commitment to self-restraint. Basically, since all the members of the elite, of the nobility, benefited from the extractive nature of the state, they all had vested interest in preserving the consensus. Because if someone starts acting in a way that would break the consensus and threaten the existence of the state, they were all losing. So therefore, they were all coercing each other. And this is the idea from Violence and Social Orders that I apply to this paper. The twist is that I argued that power concentration and rising inequality of influence within the elite erodes this ability to credibly self-restrain and destroys this elite binds itself contract enforcement mechanisms that the state may rely on. Without this ability to basically have to form a credible commitment, have an enforcement mechanism, it cannot credibly commit to collaboration, cannot create political contracts, cannot reach consensus, and since a parliamentary system requires consensus, the system may fail. And this happens because some members of the elite may no longer benefit from the system, so they have no interest in being the enforcers in the system. Especially if some people are becoming super powerful and others are becoming very disenfranchised, but they still have political rights, we have a development of patronage systems of clients and patrons. And you can imagine that clients are not good enforcers of their patrons' commitments. So clientelism, in this sense, erodes this commitment mechanism. Another thing is if you have super powerful members of the elite, like think oligarchs, they start building their oligarchic factions. So instead of having this system that everyone kind of constrains everyone else, you have competition between oligarchic factions. And there you can think that a gain of one faction is always a loss of another faction via relative deprivation because they have a political struggle. So it's very, very difficult to form Pareto improving decisions because you always think that if someone gains, the other person is losing. That's the idea here. Here to represent this graphically, it's a simple stylistic model. Basically, think of this that you are a member of the nobility in Poland, Lithuania, and do you support the state or you don't support the state, right? You support the state if you benefit from the state. And you benefit from the state if you get some rents from the state. It can be either you just receive money from the state, or it can be you own land and serfs, and you need the state to guarantee your property rights and make sure that serfs don't run away. So basically, if you are, how much rents you get depends on how influential you are. If you are absolute nobody, no one is interested in securing your support. If you are very, very influential, the state and others make sure to have you on board to keep this coalition of power going. So if you are very not influential, you don't get any rents. At some point, you start getting some rents, and the more rents you get, the more you support the state. The trick here is that once you have so much power, you own so much land, you have your own soldiers, you have your own clients and so on, you can form your own mini-state. You don't require this coalition of power. And since there's always opportunity costs by agreeing, contracting with others, if I promise I will do something, it restrains my actions. So there's always opportunity cost to it. Sometimes those opportunity costs outweighs your benefit of being part of this coalition. And there's this point where you're just so powerful, so influential, that you no longer benefit from being part of the state and can form your own mini-state, basically, and you no longer benefit from supporting it. So basically, that's the idea. Another twist here is that when the state is formed, so let us say the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is formed in the 16th century, then the coalition of power is formed. Who has the political rights is decided, members of the nobility. But after that, we have a few hundred years of history with unchanged political system, but changing societal conditions underpinning it. Some people will get more influence, some people will lose the influence, right? So when we start, by definition, every member of the political elite must be somewhere in this range when the system is formed. With time, some people lose their kind of social status, but retain their political rights, and others are becoming very, very, very powerful and accumulate land and influence and marriages and positions and so on. And those people will become patrons of the clients who basically lost everything. And that system erodes this elite binds itself system, right? Because it shifts to patronage. So basically, all of this leads to clientelism. I discussed this. This results in factional conflict because there's different courts of those patrons, right? And the clients oppose one another. That's not good for democracy. And as I said, gain of one faction is relative deprivation of another faction. As you see in American politics now, they can never agree on anything because if you give one side a win, the other one feels that they are losing out. So the model predictions are this. So basically we are saying, well, maybe absolutism in early modern Europe made some sense, and that's why many countries arrived at this as an equilibrium state where you had just one patron of all the patrons, and this created political cohesion with time. The second thing is that if you have those super powerful oligarchs, you just need to pay them off. And we can think of, I don't know, Russia's regime right now and the oligarchs there who get lots and lots and lots of money from the state to ensure their political loyalty. But in order to do that, you need to have a lot of resources and have high fiscal capacity. So this system will not work in a state with low fiscal capacity because you just don't have enough resources to offset those powerful members of the elite at some point. Okay, so this is the case of Poland-Lithuania. It was the largest parliamentary regime in Europe. It limited the authority of the king, but it still failed in the late 18th century. Political rights were clearly defined, and the elite could negotiate freely, so we can really talk about this model I was talking about. It required unanimity of decision making in the parliament, so all of this is very relevant, and it developed serfdom as a means of extraction. This is sometimes confusing. Poland formally had a king, Lithuania had a Grand Duke. They were just one person, but in practice, it was an elected chairman of the Senate. So it was a very, very limited, that person had very, very limited authority, could be deposed, had to summit parliamentary session regularly, so could not rule without the parliament, and had very, very little kind of fixed revenue and very little fiscal capacity of the state. Parliament had to all the time agree on new taxation in order to finance state operation and the king. So it was very, very, very weak position. One of the things, the prerogatives of the king was, however, appointment to the Senate. Almost by definition, and all the historiography agrees to this, all the most influential people in the country resided in the Senate. You are a magnate, you are an oligarch because you have a seat in the Senate. In order to get the seat in the Senate, the king has to appoint you, and appoints you for life. Okay? And this is what I'm going to be studying, those population of senators, to show you that some of them became very, very influential. So basically what we have here is the upper tier officials, like voivodes and ministers. Voivode is like a governor of a province. So they have actual power. And we have lower tier officials like castellans and bishops who are more ceremonial. There's around 140 of those senators from important families. What's important here is that the king and the state promotes this concentration of influence. In the paper and the book it's being discussed that, gives the land to the members of the elite, promotes strategic marriages between members of the elite, absolves the debts of the elite, allows them to form fideikommis, that they don't need to subdivide the land between their heirs, that creates economic basis behind the socio-economical and political power of those members of the elite. This in one graph you can see like land accumulation by some of the most powerful families with the biggest estates as big as, I don't know, the province of Holland in the Netherlands where I live, right? So it's just point is that they build their own private mini-states because those are allodial states, meaning that they're the supreme judges of the people living in those areas, right? So they have a lot of political power there. So I link the failure of the parliament, the same, to the growing increase in influence by a few individuals, resulting in their loss of the vested interest to cooperate. Some of those people that have those massive estates prefer to build their own estate, country, rather than to cooperate. This happens because they lacked third-party enforcement by the king. They struggle to commit credibly to political contract and sustain unanimous consensus. So this is what I theoretically derived why they run into trouble. So what happens is we have this institution of liberum veto starting in 17th century, which basically means that one member of the parliament can leave parliamentary session and say, I don't allow it to continue, and the session is stopped. Not only it is stopped, all of the decisions made by the members of the parliament are not turned from bills to acts because they didn't receive the royal assent that happens at the end of the session. Basically, if someone leaves the session, it gets interrupted, nothing gets decided. And only one person can do this. And that just, it's a very hard condition for unanimity, let's put it this way. And it keeps on happening in the 18th century. So I want to measure this concentration of influence, and I look at the members of the elite, and this is the people who were senators. Together with Marek Minakowski, we built a database of the genealogical connections of all of those senators of Poland-Lithuania with all of their relatives. So this is like 300,000 people and so on. At the very least, you know all of the senators and all of their direct family members, and this is what all you need to know now. Here, I'm just looking at a very simple question, is who has access to this institution, right? If the share of all senators whose father was also senator, right? The idea being that a family becomes very influential if they basically have are almost aristocratic seat in the Senate, right? And here you can see that, especially in the 18th century, this group of voivodes and ministers, the very powerful people, well, almost nearly 70% of them were there because their father was also there. So then I dig a little bit deeper, and I'm sorry if you cannot see this, it's like how many generations back it happens. The idea being that if someone has big pedigree in the Senate, that person is very, very influential, comes from de facto aristocratic family. And if you cannot see this well, I'm basically saying that in the 18th century, there's a group of families that had already like 30 or 40 other senatorial ancestors in the Senate, which I think intuitively just tells you, wow, they come from very powerful families. And here I can list who they are, and in the book you will read all about them, and if you know Polish-Lithuanian history, you know who those families are, and just to show you empirically that something like that is happening. I wanted to show you that it also matters. I told you that if someone, you could offset those very powerful people and ensure their collaboration if you give them money. King had some opportunities there. There were around 1,000 state-owned, so king-owned estates in Poland-Lithuania, and the king could appoint someone to supervise those for some money, right? So this was the opportunity to offset someone's, to ensure their collaboration. And I gather information from 1770, who exactly had which estates, how much money they generated, and it very nicely correlates with this measure how many ancestors that person had in the Senate, to show you that this had some real political influence, that those people had real political power that needed to be offset by the king. At the same time, the state had very, very little fiscal capacity, and here you see the fiscal capacity in Poland-Lithuania in European context, and you can see that, I think it's the black one, and it's just very, 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 very little money. The budget is just very, very small. All of this goes on warfare, so it does not have enough money to basically offset those powerful individuals endlessly. That's the idea here. What I also did, prompted by the referees, was I actually found information on the use of every single liberum veto, who triggered liberum veto, and they studied for like the encyclopedia of famous Poles, 50-volume beast, exactly who those people were, who their patrons were, and what exactly happened. So there's a long table. So what is important now is I identified that they were all clients of powerful families. Okay? So basically what happens, some of those powerful families put their clients into the parliament, and those clients trigger the veto, and there's always a conflict between two or more powerful families over control. And in a well-functioning political system, they will be able to just form a consensus and continue the operations of the state. Instead, they choose violence and trigger the veto. Okay, so how much time do I have left?
5 minutes.
Perfect. So this did not make it to the paper because I want to make it another paper, which is going to be about elite persistence and playing things with network analysis and so on. So here I'm just really interested what you think and like how to expand on this. So basically I was, since I said, information of all of the senators and relatives of those senators, and I look at plus 7 degrees of ancestors, right? And I'm basically trying to understand how central those people were in the family network of the entire elite of Poland-Lithuania throughout its existence. And I look at this through 2 different ways. One is the so-called affinity score. Affinity score simply means I look at for every senator, how many other senators that person had. In the previous version, you could only see in the direct line, father, son, Here, it's also marriages and all of the brothers, sisters, cousins, and so on, right? So it's very expanded through family network. And I divided it by the genealogical distance in a sense that if your great-great-grandfather was a senator, it weighs a little bit less than your father was a senator, and so on. And here you can see that there's this gradual concentration of influence by the people who were voivodes and ministers, were basically way more connected. And there's a benchmark of those castellans and bishops who remained more or less the same connected over time. And what I really like is that in 1764 we have a coup. Basically, Russia intervenes once again, puts their client on the throne of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and they do an anti-oligarchy coup and replace it with new people. And you can clearly see how those new people are from outside of the established family network. So that reassures me that we are actually capturing something we want to hear. Another way, which is just the standard measure of centrality of a node in a network, in network analysis, is the eigenvector centrality score. And I studied this, and I am just showing you the composition of the Senate in the middle 17th century and late 18th century. And you can see that in the middle 17th century, those people were way less connected. Fewer people were in this cluster of a family network. If they are not in this cluster, means that they are not a part of the oligarchy, right? Those are people not related. And here you have many more senators who are part of this family network, and you can see that those nodes are also bigger, much more interconnected. So there's, I would say, oligarchization of the parliament in the 18th century, and I would argue that those people just have so much power and influence that they leave everyone else behind. And it's just, you have this disconnect between the elite within the elite and the rest of the country. That creates problems. Well, I can skip this. This is just some funny way of asking computer software, help, please tell me who the factions are based on how they are intermarried, and it identifies factions to convince you that there is a factional conflict there. This is how I try to measure inequality, and basically the idea here is that if you have an open political system, open access, if your family connections do not determine what kind of job you get in the Senate. if they determine what kind of job you get in the Senate, the system petrifies and there's low social mobility. And here you can see this between group component of Gini coefficient is exactly the way that would capture to what extent the jobs in the Senate are sorted by your influence. And this expands over time and is very nicely correlated with triggering of the veto. So that was my way of trying to capture it, you know, for those people who want some regression analysis and empirical evidence. So you have something like that. To conclude, basically, what happened was the Commonwealth in the 16th century established a political system. The underpinning, the socio-economical underpinnings of the society changed by the system. De jure was not updated. Because of this rule of unanimity, they could not update their political institutions. So it kind of started as a federation and remained federation de jure, but de facto changed into a confederation of vast allodial estates owned by those members of the Senate that together formed a new political reality. So basically, what the country, I would argue, should have done to survive is change the coalition of power and basically accept that this is now an oligarchy, lower the franchise, and let them be an oligarchy, kind of where the decisions are made. But instead, the country was stuck in a conflict between kind of disenfranchised nobility, of course, the 90% of population that are serfs, and they're also disenfranchised, and this elite within the elite who are really locked in a conflict with one another and everyone else. So changes in the concentration of influence, so inequality, can lead to different political outcomes within the same constitutional order. And I think this is interesting because we always think like that political orders are kind of static, and I'm saying it's all about the interaction between inequality levels and that political order. So the literature really focuses on the limitation of the absolutist power of the king. I would argue this is a red herring. Power can concentrate also in the hands of powerful members of the elite. We also need to pay attention to this and the political consequences of this. The parliament opposed the predatory rulers who arbitrated between the parliamentary, the most powerful people in the elite. So you can think of the parliament and the king and the senate as people who are like, it's a system of checks and balances, but it needs to be kept in check. So once the king is out and there's too much power to the senators, it derails. Okay, so this is basically what I said. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, dear Nikolaj, for these very interesting insights in the Polish-Lithuanian system of the balance.
Grazie per questa presentazione dettagliata. Adesso ritorniamo all'Europa orientale. Maïka De Keyzer.
Italiano. Two sides of the same coin, question mark, a comparison of the countryside of Antwerp and Piedmont in the long 18th century. You have the floor, please.
Thank you very much. Okay. I see that the presentation is not on the screen. Yeah. So I think we have to wait for a technical error. They don't have the presentation. Oh, that's well unfortunate.
Wait, we can fix this. Let us put it
yes, because they did have the presentation. There you go. Thank you.
You can start already.
They found it. Yes, we can start. Because I will start in the beginning, we don't have any graphs anyway. So, sorry for the confusion. we are indeed going to look at the same type of topics that have been central to this conference, to social mobility. But the question of social mobility until now has mostly been asked or answered through looking at occupations, certain documents like marriage records and looking at parish records and so on. Or looking at income trends, looking at wealth inequality. And people have asked the question, okay, when did individuals rise up or move down on the social ladder? Okay, so we're on, thank you. We want to jump into this debate, but by looking at, well, first of all, taxes, so the same kind of source, but then we want to add probate inventories. Probate inventories because we think that one of the very important things of how people can rise or fall on the social ladder is also what kind of material welfare, what kind of material living standards can people obtain. Because it says something about your status, your social status, your cultural status in the community. And obtaining certain status symbols also can reflect something about social mobility, even when you are staying quite stagnant when it comes to your property or your profession. We start from the thesis, and this is, I think, maybe a little bit of a different thesis than what we have heard for the last couple of sessions and days, that regions that could obtain economic growth, that they actually could trigger social mobility. Because if you look, for example, at the thesis of Jan Luiten van Zande, looking at the Low Countries, you can see that during these periods of economic bloom and blossoming and growth, some individuals could really grab the opportunities, could get more skills, could get more income, could get more wealth, and therefore move up the food chain, while some others could not really enjoy all the fruits of that economic growth. So the question is, what does economic growth trigger? What kind of social mobility does that trigger? Now, there are some serious debates about it. Does it trickle down? Does economic growth lead to opportunities for everybody, or doesn't it lead to that kind of trickle down? Another debate, if you look at Peer Vries, in his book Escaping Poverty, he says that basically you need economic growth for any type of society to move from a bare bones kind of living style to a more respectable living style and better material possessions. And so we want to test this hypothesis. We want to test whether or not regions that experienced economic growth were actually then better off, and that it led to more social mobility of people climbing up the social ladder, yes or no. And we are therefore going to compare growth, regions that experienced economic growth, with what we could call a steady state economy. But I will get back to that. And we're going to analyze that by, well, a two-step approach. First of all, we follow a little bit in the steps of what, for example, the team of Guido Alfani has done, but also Jan Luiten van Zande, by looking at inequality, by looking at tax registers, what's happening there. Is there upward social mobility? Is there downward social mobility? Who is doing what? And then we look at these probate inventories, and we are going to look at certain indicators of social mobility, of social standing, luxury goods. So if you, for example, look at colonial products, at luxuries, who is able to obtain them and who is not. And often it's presumed that pretty much only these market economies, these tiny little group of regions could actually obtain it, because there you see that market economies, they are better embedded in international trade connections. They are the ones that get these colonial products, these luxury products in, and they have the money to buy them, while a lot of other regions, like for example peasant economies in the countryside, were just too poor to actually even try to obtain these type of goods. So we are going to compare these type of societies, and we're going to see whether or not that holds true. And so to do that, you need case studies. So which case studies did we select? So we focus only on rural regions. So we're not focusing on cities, we're focusing on rural societies. And so first of all, we needed to pick societies that you can label market economies. There's not a lot of choice for that if you look at rural societies. And we use the definition of Bas van Bavel for market economies. According to Bas van Bavel, a market economy is a society where land, labor, and capital are predominantly allocated through the market. That's the definition of the word. And so that was the basic premise. And then we needed to select societies that experienced pre-modern economic growth. Then the selection is even smaller. Not all of market economies actually experienced economic growth. But if you look at a lot of the literature, now the point has been made that there are regions that experienced sustained pre-modern economic growth. And of course, everybody has looked at the Low Countries, and especially at Holland and the North Sea area, but also in Italy, you could say that in the region of Piemonte, that there actually they also had a resurgence in some particular areas. So we looked into these regions and we selected for the Low Countries the Scheldt polder area. That's the map on the left-hand side. It's the polder area right next to the city of Antwerp, to the north of nowadays Belgium. It's one of the most capitalistic kind of agricultural regions in the Low Countries, and we've chosen the province of Vercelli in Piemonte. Because there also, but Alberto is going to elaborate on that, they really switched to a capitalist market economy. So both regions experienced what you could call the agrarian revolution, where you have these big farms that are worked by wage laborers. They are focusing on commercial products. They're completely dependent on markets. It's not just a commodity market, they're completely dependent on it. They go for new crop rotations, they go for new technologies, they go for fierce capital investments and technology, and therefore have fundamentally pushed up yields and productivity, labor and land productivity up. And so they sustained what you can call economic growth. We want to contrast that, and so you need regions which are quite close by because they need to be comparable, so they need to be in the same political constitutions, they need to be in the same juridical kind of structures. So we looked at regions close by, but of a fundamentally different economic structure. So for the Low Countries, we looked at, so we chose peasant economies with large communal structures, so not private property, but common property. Where they had absolutely no evolution in the direction of an agrarian revolution, where they did not opt for accumulation strategies, where they did not opt for the productivity rises. And for the Low Countries, well, right next door to the polder area, you have what they call the Campine area. And it's the map on the left-hand side again, where you could see just a tiny little village with vast swaths of common property. And for Piemonte, we chose the Susa Valley. And what you can clearly see here is that they are what you could call, with a modern terminology, a steady-state economy. They remained as stable as they can get. They did not have what you could call a market economy because neither labor, land, nor capital was allocated through the market. But they are not fully autarkic. No society in the pre-modern period is fully autarkic. They were engaged in commodity markets, but they're not fundamentally dependent on it. And so these two types of societies we wanted to compare. But I'm going to give the floor to Alberto, who is going to explain what we discovered.
Thank you. Sorry, I'll take the microphone. Okay, thank you very much, Maïka. So now for the more analysis of the data of the result, we are going to start with wealth inequality, We adopted indeed an approach similar to that developed by the team of Guido Alfani and Van Zanden in other works and by many scholars in this room, and we decided to look first of all at the concentration of wealth. Therefore, we developed Gini indexes, and then most importantly, we wanted to look at the distribution of wealth across the society. The case has been made that in pre-modern periods, inequality rose basically almost universally across Europe. And we do see that this picture is reflected in all of our 4 case studies, but with some interesting differences between peasant and market-oriented societies. Peasant societies are consistently, they experience inequality growth, but they are consistently more egalitarian than market-oriented ones. And more interestingly, we do think that this is due to the fact that elites in peasant societies were not able to capture the same share of the community wealth as they did in market-oriented economies, which is a point often brought forward in this kind of debates, that the inequality was driven primarily by the households in the top 10 to 1%. We do see, for example, interestingly, that among peasant societies, both in the Kempen and in the Valley of Susa, the middling groups are quite resilient. The ratio D5-1, for example, is constantly higher than the ratio D10-5, meaning that at least from a distributive point of view, the middling groups are more similar to the upper than the lower, to their wealthier than their poorer neighbors, while we see that in the market-oriented areas, the ratio remains more or less the same throughout the century, and you really have the local elites quickly outstripping the rest of society. But this also means that among peasant societies, the growth of inequality went particularly against the smaller-most households, who sort of carried the brunt of this rise of inequality. But of course, these are all measures about distribution of wealth. They don't really say stuff about, they don't really say things about how people actually lived, what were their material living standards. We therefore decided to use probate inventories, and we decided to use them to peek into the material wealth of pre-modern households. Now, probate inventories are an established source in the study of early modern and pre-industrial household wealth. They have been particularly used by Professor De Vries with the development of the idea of the industrial evolution and then all the debate surrounding it. And the case has been made that the pre-modern period is a period characterized by a rise of material wealth across basically all households among households in particularly commercially societies, spurred by the desire of live and adopt consumption trends and material culture similar to those of the wealthiest members of society, either the city elites or the nobility with a capital N. Therefore, we could expect to see an increase among market-oriented society, but not so much among the peasantries. What we see instead, for the case of Piedmont, for which the data have been so far elaborated, is that this increase is rather instead universal across both kinds of society, and especially it cuts across all members of society. It still remains true that it is in the market-oriented area of Vercelli where the local elites became particularly wealthier, both in absolute and in relative terms, if we look at the rate of increase of the stock of movable goods in the households as a proxy for general material wealth, but all groups experience some kind of material upheaval during this period. Again, we wanted to look at material wealth to gain some understanding about early modern social mobility. We therefore, following previous historiography, selected those kind of goods that are truly indicative of this newfound desire of for households to better the social position, to live like a more lavish lifestyle, to appear not only better but also wealthier. Following, indeed, in the steps of previous historiography, we decided to look at conspicuous consumption, a series of luxuries and products that are indicative of this shift in consumer culture. New luxuries is indeed a basket term that indicates objects such as painting, mirrors, and clocks that start to appear with a higher frequency in this period in households across Europe. Colonial products is all products coming from the colonies, such as coffee, tea, spices, and all the items for their consumption. And then maiolica and glazed earthenwares, we have to include them, but we have decided not to include them with new luxuries, because while they are indicative of a new consumption and a new desire among households, is debatable whether or not they represent always a mark of luxury. What we see is, first of all, two significant differences between Piedmont and between Piedmont and between the Low Countries when it comes to the trends. If we stick to Piedmont, the picture painted by the Fries seems to be conformed indeed. Only the market-oriented economy of Vercelli has an increase in households of the distribution, for example, of new luxuries, while colonial products, funnily enough, remain similar among both areas. New luxuries instead, in the province of Vercelli, managed to breach the biggest, most elite, let's say, and to circulate more by the end of the 18th century than they did in the beginning, while in the province of Susa they remained more or less the domain of a very well-established elite with a small shrink, as you can see, from 12 to 9.6%. But the picture should be more nuanced if we move away from Piedmont above the Alps and we go to the Low Countries. We do see that in the scaffolder area, it is still households in the scaffolder area that show the highest degree of luxurious consumption, but at the same time, there is a significant rise in the Campen of households with new luxuries among their properties, meaning that in a peasant society such as the Campen, regardless of the agrarian revolution or productivity rise, etc., peasants managed to increase and to live more lavish lifestyle at the end of the period than they did in the beginning. And of course, these are aggregate data, and then, let's see. Okay, then we moved away from aggregate data and we decided to look into the distribution across society. We identified some groups that we defined as interesting. Notables are basically the liberal professionals, the local elites such as very large landowners, and people that are identified in the inventories such as serfs or other distinguishable titles. Peasants are the people that are defined as those who live off their agricultural production. This is sort of the rough translation that you can find in the sources, and they are small to medium landowners, and wage laborers instead as indeed agricultural wage laborers in their entirety, as it is not often clear what place in the hierarchy they actually had. For the Low Countries, instead, the stratification has been made based on cattle ownership as a sign of wealth within the society, with a small caveat that indeed for the Low Countries, the one in the class low could also at times include those kind of non-agricultural elites that don't own cattle, but they also include the poorest ones, the poorer peasants that have basically nothing aside of their house. What we see is that for example, if we stick to the picture of Vercelli, that 18% is not a random 18%, but should be interpreted as the wealthiest most 18% of the society. It's still a sort of distribution at the top. Therefore, only the households among the wealthiest most could experience some kind of improvement in their lifestyle. Interestingly enough, also is to know that among the notables in Susa by the end of the 18th century, a small percentage, comparatively small percentage of them adopted the consumption of new luxuries, while in colonial products we are almost similar. This is a point that we are still reasoning around what are the main drivers between in the difference between these two numbers, such as it has been argued that notable should be the more receptive and, of course, the most wealthy and capable of adopting these new kind of trends. Also, peasants in the province of Vercelli are notably wealthier than those in Susa, but they are a much smaller group, and they do own land in one of the most integrated agricultural market of the northern Italian plains. And while wage laborers are completely excluded, so the biggest group of society could not join into these new consumption trends, if not for the acquisition of some plates of maiolica. If we look instead to the Low Countries, we see that the situation is a little bit more murky. For the Campine area, there is not really a trend of wealth and the distribution of this product that is uniform across the different kind of selected categories of items, while for the scaled border area it seems to be a little bit more tight, but even in that case, is not a clear-cut line between the two. Okay, then we decided to, we sat around the table and we said, but are we truly looking at what really matters for households in a rural context? Are luxuries the only kind of measure that we should use to evaluate whether or not households decided to improve their lifestyles and improve their material wealth? What else could the peasants and houses in a rural context be interested in? Therefore, we decided to sort of get out of the rails of, let's say, of the established pathway and look into non-luxury goods, into what we defined as a necessary consumption. And though these are some items that are not only fundamental for the livelihood of the households, but represent also crucial economic assets for the household itself throughout the period. Cattle, in this case milk cows, represent indeed both a source of dietary quality for the household, but also of income through the products of husbandry. Fuel, there is a lot of literature on the scarcity or perceived scarcity of wood throughout the 18th century, the rise of, for example, the wood industry in the 18th century connected with a demographic rise of many European cities. And foodstuff, of course, are the base of the peasant alimentation. What we see is that in this period we have a consistent investment among especially peasant societies in increasing this kind of, the stocks of this kind of goods in particular, more than those of luxurious consumption, which tied together with what we have seen in the beginning, a general rise of material wealth, we have interpreted as maybe a symptom of different priorities being at place between the two different areas. And while the case could certainly be made that this also has to do with the socioeconomic context we are looking at, the fact that peasant households had to be somewhat self-sufficient and therefore they would have to own this kind of items, it's still very much noticeable that the trend is increasing, and is increasing notably, especially if we take the value of Susa in the presence of fuel and a little bit less in the presence of milk cow due to shrinking in the second half of the 18th century for reasons that are often, unfortunately, external. Therefore, if we move now towards the conclusions, if the PowerPoint allows it. Thanks. Yeah. So to conclude, indeed, we start our research by asking the question of what if we look at social mobility through lenses outside of occupation, outside of marriage strategies? What if we took an approach focused on were people actually able to improve their material lifestyle? Were they actually able to buy into a more lavish lifestyle and therefore live as the higher social classes, the people that they would aspire to emulate, as historiography has pointed towards? What we see is that despite being a period of somewhat social mobility, there is not a single and uniform trend noticeable that we can apply both to Italy and to the Low Countries. Specifically, instead, there is a strong influence on the local context, both within and between our two case studies. If we look at inequality trend, we find that indeed all our areas experience inequality, but the peasant societies were more egalitarian than market-oriented ones, and the middling groups, particularly among peasant societies, proved to be more resilient than those in the market-oriented areas. At the same time, inequality rose especially against the lowermost group among peasant societies, even though there could be an argument whether or not the poorest households in peasant societies were more prone to remain where they own, for example, their house, and therefore access to the communally owned resources, than those in market-oriented societies, where they instead, during the 18th century, lost basically their house and then moved, for example, towards the cities, an argument that has been made in the Crisis of the Peasantry historiography. Then if we look at material culture, we see that luxuries as the sole domain of, are luxuries the sole domain of the wealthy, and here we see a difference between the Low Countries and Italy. perhaps a symptom of the little divergence, perhaps the symptom of the fact that the Low Countries are maybe in a more integrated international market than Piedmont during the same time period. The picture for Piedmont seems to confirm in this idea that only households in a market and economy could improve, at least among the wealthy, their lifestyle against those in a peasantry, while those in Low Countries murky this interpretation and show instead a case, at least in the case of the Kempen, of peasant households increasing their material wealth and their lifestyle aspirations. And finally, a point of reflection also for us and for our research is the role played by consumption beyond the luxuries, and whether or not focusing on only luxuries is limiting when looking at a peasant societies, whether we should take into consideration those kind of items that were fundamental for households in a rural context, and maybe reevaluate also what it means to improve one lifestyle, as we have seen that there is an investment priority clearly among peasant societies for these kind of items. So thank you very much. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much, dear Maïka and dear Alberto, for this very clear analysis. Due to all of your very good time management, we have now half an hour coffee break, but please use the coffee break not only for drinking coffee, but also for filling out our formulas so we can have a very good discussion afterwards. We will meet us again at 11 o'clock. Thank you very much. many, many questions. This is a very good sign. This will be an intense discussion. And we will do it to inform you. We will have all the questions.
Très bien, on peut donc démarrer notre petit débat ensemble. Donc, je voudrais donner la parole à toutes les personnes qui ont donc demandé de parler. Donc, on va démarrer avec ces questions. Nous avons donc Marc. La première question, je vous en prie. Je voudrais tester donc le fonctionnement du micro. Est-ce qu'il marche? Merci beaucoup pour vos discours, vos recherches. Donc, je crois qu'il est très utile donc, de pouvoir faire cette analyse au niveau local. Donc, il est très important pour insérer dans un contexte plus élargi tout cela. Donc, merci pour avoir parlé des œuvres Vega, de Lope de Vega. Il faudra en parler en détail. Il serait important de parler en détail de cela, de ce sujet. Donc, merci pour avoir parlé même de Lope de Vega. Je le souligne. Donc, ma question concerne...
Creation of a big market in Juros was very useful for investment purposes for hidalgos and letrados. And I think it functioned fairly well, like bond markets often do. They're generally rather positive things. But I'm aware of the fact in the 17th century that under Philip IV, certainly, they began to pay the interest on Juros in velon, which was a form of devaluation. I mean, if Juros were circulating below par, that didn't matter too much because yields could be quite good. There's a document I've read in the British Library, and I'll send you the reference. It's a list of juristas complaining in about 1630 or something about the problems they're having with their investments. What had become a solid investment now becomes an extremely difficult one. So I'm just wondering if you've got sort of upward social mobility, creation of a bond market, sound investment portfolios, etc. Does that change in the 17th century? Is it part of a 17th century crisis or not? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And next is Katja, please.
Sorry, Marcus, the questions are now for,
for
Mikolaj and only for Hilario. Okay, so I'll be back in a bit. So for David and Hilario, I was wondering how, so if I understood well, you depart from Simón Ruiz, the archive, right? So my question would be, how does Burgos compare if you apply your methodological analysis to other similar commercial towns in Castile, taking, if you keep Seville away and all of those more particular spaces, how would this compare? Would you see similar social mobilities? Because if I hear what you're explaining, I would see these, Évora would be the same. So if you look at the other side of the border, I would think Coimbra would be more or less the same, although there's the university, so you have a little bit of another layer. So, so what is this particularity of Burgos, if there is any? And if it's not a particular case, how does this compare? Can you have a kind of a Castilian social mobility pattern or something in that sort?
Sorry, Katja, also to Mikolaj.
Also to Mikolaj. All right. I thought as much. Hi. 2 points. One about your argument for this paper, right? Power concentration and rising inequality of influence, not of income or of wealth, although during your presentation you associate these things, right? Within the elite, erode its ability to bind etc. I think I have a lot of questions. So, if we forget all the new economic institutionalists that you mentioned, which I understand why you mentioned them, and if you would ask the same question and make the same argument, but you depart from the arguments by Peter Burke or Jeroen Doudem about the nature of the state, what would happen to your argument? And how would you reinterpret the numbers that you have? Because it seems to me, but perhaps I misunderstand, that you're talking about the relationship between the power of the state, the power of the ones in the state, and patterns of possible inequality. That's what Peter Burke does, that's what Jeroen Doudem does, but the problem is they don't believe that the state exists, as they don't believe that elites can be defined as, of course, usually happens by new economic institutionalism, as a group, which leads me then to the second question, which is more to your second article that you're thinking about the networks. Why do you think that network analysis is gonna answer your question? Because without any network analysis, it seems obvious to me, I think it would be obvious to most people in this room, that if you have generational, patriarchal transmission of social capital, bourgeois social capital, of course, that's what you get. So my question would be, so what happens if you mix the ministers' category with the bishops? Are those groups interconnected? The reason why I ask is because people have been thinking about the East India Company in England, which is a totally different game, right? About so who's in this East India Company? They were analyzing the shareholders. You always get this same conclusion. You have 10 guys who are very powerful, controlling everything. Actually, that's not true. When you look at network analysis, the book by Edmund Smith is a great starting point. When you see actually how these people are in partnerships, so in joint ownership of power and of rents, you see that the group is far broader, even of people that have been excluded from rents and from shares. Of course, it's a commercial world, perhaps does not apply at all to the space you're looking into, but looking at social network and social network constructions within the same group, I'm not sure you're going to conclude anything else than what we would expect. So if you don't apply the network theory outside of the group you're looking into, you're going to conclude, yeah, they intermarry, yeah, sure. That's how they accumulate capital. Who accumulates the most capital? The ones that intermarry the more often with less than 5 families. So I'm curious to know, so how do you gonna reach a different conclusion than what we are already expecting? Because that would then justify why the use of social network theory. But I'm sure you have perhaps arguments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next is Marianne, please. First to Mikolaj and then to Maïka and Alberto.
So first, Malkoski, I was very convinced by your paper. I thought the model was very neat. My question is, do you think that there are any elements of your model that could be applied to urban factionalism? And not necessarily urban factionalism in Italy, although I would be interested to hear your comments on that. I'm thinking of English towns, for example, in the late Middle Ages and early modern period. Some of these towns were rife with factionalism. Others never had that kind of problem. They're all urban oligarchies, slightly different forms of government, but very similar. Now, the state there was only stepped in, the king only stepped in when things became very dire. So in your model, could you consider the urban constitution itself a state power, or in your model, does the state power always have to be a monarch? These oligarchs certainly had access to rents in the terms of favorable conditions of leasing, and they were in a position to give the leases out, for example. Favorable conditions in the courts, things like that, that they also had. One problem is that urban dynasties rarely last more than 3 generations. And I was impressed, I mean, how long your dynasties were lasting, but you then mentioned that you're tracking them through marriage. So these are presumably, when you're lasting 200 years, one family, is that because you're tracking them through the female line and they're absorbing that money and that power? Anyway, that's my question for you. Thought your paper was fascinating, good comparative. I have first of all, a question, and the question is about the number of inventories you looked at, because you never put an N on any of your charts, and in a footnote you said that in the Campine you had 47, and Scheldt you had 33, fine, but Piedmont you had 150 for each, so that's a vast difference. And I'm thinking when I'm looking at some of your tables, especially the tables where you're looking at lower class, how many inventories are you talking about? How did you choose those inventories? Because the potential for bias there, when the sample is fairly small, is pretty large. And my second is really more of a comment and a suggestion. I'm not sure you know of an English historian named Jeremy Goldberg. He wrote an article on looking at probate inventories for the 15th and early 16th centuries in northern England. And he was really, what he was interested in is looking and see whether there was a difference in accumulation strategies of urban or rural residents. And what struck me, the parallel that I see, is that the rural residents who were of the same social, the income groups as the urban people he was looking at, they're all middling, if slightly like yeoman class, they were choosing to reinvest in farm equipment. Exactly what you're finding. The urban differences, now this is a society that's much less, much poorer, not as many goods. There's no colonial goods really in this period. But the two items that stood out were silver spoons and cushions. So anyway, it might be interesting for you to look at that because he's looking at urban-rural, but it's that parallel with rural yeomen choosing to invest in farm equipment.
Thank you very much. And now Olga has a question to Maïka and Alberto.
Thank you very much. Congratulations to all the writers of these very interesting papers. My question refers to the last paper, who combined Piemonte and the countryside in Antwerp. I would like to have some more explanations about the reasons that you have chosen these areas. Did the agricultural products have, for example, or the conditions of productivity and commercialization had some similarities that could conduct to comparison in social mobilization? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olga. And now, Professor Viale.
So, thank you for the paper. So the first question is, have you counted the number of items in the various categories? Because the frequency of possession is nice, but having just one coffee pot or one item is, so one thing is having few items and another thing is having more items. And another suggestion is maybe looking at colonial goods is a little bit misleading for Italy, because we know that even if we look at big cities like Venice, the spread of these items in private homes appears quite lately, basically after the 1720s. So maybe it would be nice to see the spread of more luxurious goods, to see it mirrors, silk clothes, cotton clothes, or stuff like that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And Katja, once again, please.
So for your collective paper, Maïka and Alberto and Jan, the Ernitis. I think my question is, how would you be able to make the same argument for areas where market working, so you have, in spaces where you have a lower density of markets, a la Van Bavel, working mostly for the rural land? Or is this only applicable to spaces where you have hyper markets?
Thank you very much. And the next is Professor Schofield, please.
Thanks everyone for a really interesting session. This is for Maïka and Alberto. One of the things that medievalists are often greedy to see things pushed back a little, and I really enjoyed the distinctions you set out, and I was thinking of sort of modern comparison like Philip Huang's work on China, but we're also aware in a medieval context of the kind of considerable variety within communities in terms of relative wealth and actually how that's played out in terms of possession. So I don't know how far it's possible to push back or to reflect on a sort of pre-colonial era and whether you can make any similar identifications or indeed whether you can speculate as to what it is we're looking at as change in this respect, because you've got nice change over time reflected in your data, but is it possible to think about how the situation might have operated previously? I appreciate that may be an unfair and implausible kind of question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we will have Matteo on the papers of David and Hilario, and Maïka and Alberto.
Yes, thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. The first one is for Professor Casado and Carvajal. In your conclusion, you told us that social mobility, in your case, studies growth during that period. But my question is if you have any information on the complex of the society, because you show us some individual trajectory of this mobility, but my question is, what do you know about the society in the complex in this period? And for Maïka and Alberto, thank you very much, very interesting paper. My question or my remark is similar to what already done. The first is relative to the colonial goods and why you don't choose to, for example, measure a consumable basket in a more traditional ways, and you focus on this kind of goods that for a region like Piedmont is something very difficult to find, at least up until the end of the early modern period. And the second question is related to how you define social groups. For example, in a table you show how social groups and who are the poor in these societies, for example. And the last one, but is something that is already stressed by others, is the number of proprietary inventories and the how is representative proprietary inventories of the whole of these societies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now, Maria, please, also on to Hilario and David, and Maïka and Alberto.
Thank you very much. I would like to
complement the session in general. My question to Hilario and David is about sources. I'm very fascinated by these padrones that you mentioned. And if I understand correctly, you posit two major types within a variety. Padrón de bienes y padrón de quantías. But what I would like to understand a bit more is that they provide different types of data, but in the presentation you also said they don't necessarily provide data about the wealth. They might provide only data about the estimate of how much contributions they would have to pay. And these documents were also used for trying to apply for hidalguía. So how much figures, what's the percentage of what gives figure about wealth and what gives about estimate from what you've seen, and what internal bias there is in something that it's used? Because if I understood correctly, you found them in the Cancelleria, so they have been used to provide. So there might be a bias towards those that actually made it into hidalguía as opposed to those that just tried. Is it clear? And then to Maïka and Alberto, I wanted to know about figures as well, about number of inventories. But what intrigued me when you were talking about, I share some of the concerns about colonial goods in Piedmont. Have you tried, just as an experiment, and if you have the data already inputted, could be relatively easy, to check the presence or not of those type of articles that have been defined under the label of populax? So those articles that are expression of status in a lower quality and that start to emerge from the beginning of the 18th century, so just to show off to your neighbors as opposed to evidence of real wealth. Because if the point is also social representation, seeing whether these eminently urban items actually percolated into the countryside might give you another way to differentiate between the groups. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. And the next is Salvatore, who has a question for Mikolaj and Alberto.
Yes, to Malinowski, I have to make my compliments because very interesting paper, inspiring paper, because for me it was very natural to try to make comparison with the Venetian state, the Venetian patriciate, which was at the end ultimately a little bit more open, I have to say, in comparison with the Polish elite. So the question is why? It's always my personal question, why? So do you find something on the agricultural economy which provoked a kind of stability or the conservative political framework, so agriculture and the feudal system, perhaps? The question to Concina was about the Susa Vercelli. What kind of role play, for instance, rice cultivation in Vercelli? Because that's a very important input in this area. So when you talk about also luxury is not the symbol of wealthy. So colonial products, they are not the symbol of wealthy. So, but all of the economic history is trying to say that the more developed economy were basically about conspicuous consumption and the luxury items. So I think that you fall on moral inside if you look about what does it mean luxury consumption or conspicuous consumption. So we move from luxury, from economic to moral or sociological aspects, I think. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Salvatore. And last but not least, Professor Seiderdin, to all of you.
Okay, thanks to all presenters. This was a very, very good session. I really enjoyed it. To David and Hilario, yeah, again, a question about public debt, about these euros. I was also wondering, what is the role of public debt here? It's not discussed very often in this Settimana, but we all know that especially in the 16th century there is an enormous increase in public debt in many areas in Europe and especially in Castile. And you're both specialists. So I was just wondering to what extent you could say something about whether public debt and investing in public debt allowed for upward social mobility of, well, the middling sorts, or contributed to downward social mobility in the case of defaults. I mean, we are all familiar with lending to the borrower from hell. And then, of course, Streligman in Vote suggests that there are different outcomes. I mean, the wealthy may have invested for political privilege, etc., but then to what extent did this then jeopardize the position of middling group investors? So anything you can say about the role of public finance and public debt would be appreciated. Miko? Thanks. This is the third time or so I heard this, so I'm being brainwashed as we speak. It's also a bit difficult because I was trying to come up with a question I haven't asked before. But nevertheless, I'm going to ask you something I pointed out before, and that is, this is a pretty convincing case, but I think you should reconnect more to the theory and historiography on England and Low Countries. And coming from the Low Countries, from the Netherlands, two things struck me. One point, also a point Marianne makes about factions. I mean, the Dutch Republic is known for its factions. I would think that, especially hearing your comparison to the present-day US and this zero-sum game, that this should have perhaps also applied to the Dutch Republic, where there are these parties. You have Republicans, you have Royalists. So how would you fit that into the story? Because I think it should be part of the story. The second question is, I'm a little bit mean here, but the Dutch Republic did not last much longer than Poland-Lithuania. I mean, it also collapses towards the end of the 18th century. So I think in the end, these are things you should consider, and you were asking about suggestions for the book. I guess the question is, will there be some sort of a final chapter where you reconnect what you have, and what you have is very, very nice, back to this older literature about England and the Dutch Republic and the economic miracle and First Industrial Revolution. Okay, Maïka and Alberto, thanks. This was very, very good. I like the comparative approach. It's innovative, it's convincing. What struck me was that you also talked about fuel and foodstuffs, and I was just wondering, what does it signify? Are these leftovers? Is this a matter of storage, of grain and other preservable foodstuffs? Is this a matter of storage of fuel? And are you implying here that food and fuel security and being able to perhaps insure yourself is a luxury, which would not be a crazy idea? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for all these very interesting questions. And now you have the chance to answer. Hilario, David, would you be so kind to begin, please?
Well, thank you very much for your comments. Well, regarding this topic on the Juros market, it's very, very interesting. well, the juros market were in constant expansion during the 16th and mostly in the 17th century, in the first part, with less interest rates, but was in constant expansion. The first owners of these juros in the first part of the 16th century were mostly urban elites, merchants, noblemen, lords, etc. So this was the base of this system during the first 2-3 decades in the 16th century. Of course, there was something very special in this market because it was the key question in the negotiation between the king and these urban elites. It's very well known. There is different works by Carlos Álvarez Nogal that explain how the urban elites in the 70s, just before the Medio General, tried to negotiate with the king about the taxation. And the king said, okay, if you don't accept new taxes or the raise of some taxes, I cannot pay the juros, your interest rates, so you lose your money. So this is a key question to understand the behavior of these new elites. And of course, the juros was a very interesting source of rent for these people. But for the mid classes, for these medium classes in Castile, the juros market was also very interesting because when some traditional activities produce less benefits, less profits, most of these middle classes buy juros to ensure these rents. Of course, there were problems in the 17th century because the interest rates decreased a lot, and there were some problems with the king, with Philip III and Philip IV. But it was an investment. If you look in the inventories of these middle classes, it's very common to find juro in the wills, juros, censos, long-term debt, etc. So it's a very interesting thing. Well, regarding the sources, the padrones, well, we have luck. We are lucky in our case because in Castile, the padrones were used as a proof for being an hidalgo, for being recognized as a noble, as a low nobility. And for that reason, in Castile, we have a court, a special tribunal that started trial to recognize or not your condition as an hidalgo. And the best proof, one of the best proofs to prove that someone was an hidalgo was present these padrones and say, yes, I am in the padron and my name is linked with the word hidalgo, so you have to recognize my condition as hidalgo. But there were different kinds of padrones. For example, padrones de Estado, that make the difference between groups, taxpayers, households, and clergy, noblemen, etc. Only the difference between groups. There were another padrones de cuantía, with the amount to be paid in the case of the servicio, for this tax. But sometimes in the same padron, you can find different columns, different lists with different numbers, because the same padron was used for different for different taxes. For the servicio real, for a local tax, a sisa, for example, on consumption, and other taxes. So it's very interesting how the same padron could be used for different taxes, for different situations, or in different situations. So it's a little bit complex, the source, but they made possible to compare, for example, the share of privileged groups in small villages or in other villages. Fortunately, in almost all villages in Castile and in the 16th century, mostly, some neighbors request to be recognized as hidalgo. So we have more or less 1,000 padrones in this region. But well, we have to work harder on it. And about the question of Professor Di Tullio, well, we are working with our data. We don't have a more general approach to social mobility. So, but we are trying to work, we are trying to test these different focuses on social mobility. So we are trying to develop this vision on social mobility and wealth from taxation, but we are working with other sources to have a complete idea. We have to reflect about how we can mix all the points of view to have a more complex and a more clear idea about the evolution of social mobility. But I think that it's interesting to compare different points of view. But the case of nobility of Hidalgos was very clear in the 16th century. The case of the access to the military orders was very important in the 17th century. So we are working on it. And we hope in a few months or maybe a year, we have a more clear idea about the evolution of inequality and social mobility in Castile. And about Burgos, the case of Burgos, maybe Professor Casado could explain.
Ancora non abbiamo...
Yet, we do not have the patrones of the cities. We don't have the patrones of Burgos. We just have the patrones in the Chancellery Tribunal. A small town, 2,000, 3,000 inhabitants, is Burgos. We didn't find patrones. No patrones. So the case of Burgos is a special one, and Castile cases is also very special. All small towns had patrones. Social mobility of small merchants, regional merchants, climbing socially, going up since the very first half of the 16th century. After that, there's the beginning of the crisis, and you know, the slowdown period, and you know what I mean, don't you? The specialty of Burgos. Burgos is my own city, very well known, also outside Spain. In Burgos, we have international merchants. Cases we got through, we mean big import international merchants working in Florence, whatsoever, in Antwerp, so in Lisbon, Portugal, and the other cities, Segovia, or other cities in Spain, Olmedo, Rio Seco. These cities, these towns didn't get a lot of international markets or merchants. The urban oligarchy in Burgos after the 13th century, all merchants. So, they had some members, the military, and other households of Jewish origin. Merchants, also the Jews being merchants. I believe that 70% of oligarchy being merchants. But that's just one shot case. In case of Castile, I believe it's almost 50%, not more than that.
And now it's Mikolaj, it's on you.
Okay, sorry. Thank you very much for all the question, all the interest, and all the challenge. First question, thank you very much. I've been thinking about this, and I think this is very much about to which audience this paper is directed. It's a conscious choice to go more into economics with the paper, and with its focus on there is a theory and there needs to be internal consistency within the theory. If the theory assumes the existence of elite, the model builds all of this. So this is the assumption and there's the axiom. If you ask what would happen if we use basically different approach, different assumptions, I would just say the framework of the paper would absolutely collapse, because at its heart, it's trying to form a testable hypothesis built on a model and then use Polish-Lithuanian as a case to defend this, to publish in top econ journal and get tenure. This is what's happening here. When it comes to how to make it intern, but I also think it's very important, because this is what we do as on the history side of profession, is that things are internally consistent between different approaches to how we tell story, right? If we look at the same story from different perspectives, how can we still have one object? And here I just need to say that at this point I don't have a very convincing answer for you, because I would have to be more intimately acquainted with this work, and I just came from a different tradition. Okay? When it comes to the challenge that maybe there is certain iron law of oligarchy, maybe, and why study social networks? Because we know that what we are going to find, so what is that we don't know? I think there's plenty of possible hypotheses here that come directly from a research that people already started to do on this data in 1940s. What I bring to the table is actually compiling all of this information on the elite, and the research has been very fragmented on the history side of things. Questions like, Poland-Lithuania, the largest country in Europe, is the elite intermarried between different regions? Is this how we secure the cohesion of the Commonwealth, but making sure that the most powerful families from different regions are interrelated? You might immediately point out that I did not even look at this, but this is one of the things that it's very important to check out. So, for example, when I showed you the possible factions, and I insinuated that they are factions because they work together, they can also be regionally intermarried, and that's why they are factions. So this is something that I don't think that we might know. We need to learn much more about this. That is not immediately obvious. You also mentioned patriarchy. Actually, what really shows up here is that it's the marriages that drive the connectivity, which ties to the question number 4, I guess, sorry. The question was about to what extent all of this is about aristocratic lineages, and to what extent it's all about broader connections via other family members. And what we find so far, and we want to build an entire paper about this, is that this interconnectedness via kind of tight, the interconnectedness came from intermarriages in the more 16th century, and the 18th century came much more from aristocratic lineages. And I think there's a lot to play with to explain how the political elite has shifted in the time. So I think there's just a lot to that. Another thing is, if we treat the people in the 17th, 19th century really believe that it's the country of freedom, right? And that everyone, and that would be, every nobleman has an access to, because it's democracy, and every nobleman has an access to a political career. Studying who actually, whether people appointed to the Senate are outside of the family network, ergo anyone could enter, versus effectively would have to be part of the oligarchic kind of club of families to enter, it's non-trivial, I think. And we find that in different time periods there were different answers to this. Another question is about rural versus urban type of oligarchy. And actually now in the framing of the paper, one of the ways I frame it is a lot of literature is about urban oligarchies. I show that it also is relevant for the territorial state, not only for urban republics. I also think that it's important what are the incentives for collaboration. And basically, the way I think about this is because basically I postulate that urban elites need to trade much more with one another, and their wealth comes from trade. So they're very much interested in well-functioning state institutions that harmonize institutions to lower transaction and transportation costs. That makes for more effective trade. if the only thing that you need to do is produce grain and ship it to the Baltic ports via rivers, you don't really need a very well effective state. You just need to stay out of the way. Versus if you actually have a much more, your goal is to add value on the value chain, you need to safeguard low transaction transportation costs. So that would be, this is what I write now in the conclusion. The question about the Venice, the inspiration for this whole research was a paper by Puga and Treffler about Venetian elites and how economic growth led to basically rise in inequality and power concentration, how this led to erosion of the institution in the Venetian Republic. So I think there's a lot of parallels with this. I think there's a lot of parallels with Sweden as well in the period of true freedom in the 18th century when the king was also limited by parliament. And in Poland and in Sweden and possibly in Venice, despite having limitations on the authority, we have lack of economic growth in certain periods. So I think those are interesting case studies. Which leads me to the last question of what does it teach us about England and the Netherlands? I had a slide about this, but I thought that I'm in Italy, so I finally don't have to talk about England and the Netherlands, but okay. What I write there is basically that if I have, I could sell this in a way that I'm proposing a wider research agenda for the entire community, saying, look, maybe it is indeed that, the way I actually frame this now, I say, look, Guido Alfani tells us inequality is rising everywhere, so there's, let us say, there's power concentration, wealth concentration everywhere. Clearly the Netherlands and England are suffering from the same kind of pressures, but they're responding to it differently. Why? Because they have those central, Tudors or House of Orange have some kind of sway still that can negotiate with those elites, right? So this is what I write now. Another differences are, those are tiny places in comparison. So if you want things to be, there's this thing called Coase theorem, and the whole paper builds on Coase theorem. And in order for Coase theorem to work, those people need to be able to talk to one another. Since the country is so big, they cannot really talk to one another, and that's why it's difficult for them to reach consensus. Much easier in the Netherlands or Southern England. But right now, what I think I'm gonna do is be strategic about this, keep it focus on Poland, and win research money to compare it with England and the Netherlands, because maybe the Netherlands will be interested in financing this. So that's my battle plan right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And finally, Maïka, Alberto, please.
Thank you for all the very interesting questions. So I will maybe kick off some, and some will be answered by Alberto. First of all, about the number of inventories and why the Low Countries are really underrepresented right now. Well, that's my fault, because I'm naive, and I thought I would keep up the same pace as Alberto, but since he's doing it as a PhD project, and I'm doing it in between other things, I'm just much slower, because for the Campine area, we have already transcribed 200 inventories alone for that region, but I'm now stuck with annotating, but it's a work in progress. So in the future, we will have even more inventories, but since we already transcribed them, I can clearly say that even though now we only have this particular village that that we know about and that we have in the tables, we have seen that the same pattern arise in these others. So it's not going to fundamentally affect the things that we are saying right now, but unfortunately I can't show you the numbers yet in the table because I'm lagging behind. Unfortunately. So that's my fault, and that's why also the numbers keep changing a little bit, because it's a work in progress. Thank you very much, by the way, by the tip of the article of Goldberg, because that's now high on my reading list, because I didn't know it. The reason for the case selection, well, once I had, again, a naive ambition to write a big ERC project about this and going for even more regions, but then COVID appeared and then I had to switch to digital teaching, so that died somewhere in amongst creating digital classes. But that's, we started from a premise. The question, does economic growth, do market economies really push for more welfare, more prosperity? And so we wanted to find regions that really are clear market economies experiencing pre-modern economic growth. And there were only a handful of these regions. And that's why we said, okay, these are central, but then we need comparative cases which are as close by, are in the same political structure, are in the same juridical structure, are geographically close, are in the same, that have the same knowledge, that have the same access to certain markets, and so on and so on. So it was a very kind of limiting down, and therefore there only appeared a couple of options. And for the low countries, especially the Campine area and the polder area are geographically, it's 30 kilometers. There's 30 kilometers in between both areas. They're very close by. And therefore, a lot of the parameters are the same, except for the way how they organize their rural economy. So they have a different soil, but they also have a different, what Erik Thun would have called a social agro-system. So they organize the way they develop their agricultural system differently. And then we see what the effect of that is. So we try to keep as much parameters the same. Why then, in the end, Italy and the Low Countries remained? Well, that's a little bit because the two other regions that I had in mind, well, we didn't get funding for that. So that's basically why these two remained. But they are really comparable, because if you look at, for example, Susa in the Campine area, with the way they organize themselves as communal agricultural societies, they are, except for the fact that geographically they're far away, they are very comparable. The same with Vercelli and then the polder area. The choices they make, the societal choices that they make, are, to the best of our abilities, comparable. So I think that's the reason why we chose them. I don't know if you want to add to that particular question.
No, in general, just for Piedmont specifically, indeed, we needed to look at that, something that was under the same social and institutional framework in order to eliminate that, also that as a variable, because of course the tax system and the way sources are made can introduce some variables that are beyond our best intention to control them. Piedmont in this period is a period in which it expands in the 18th century towards the plain. There might have been also interesting points to see in the new territories that it acquires in Lombardy, but it acquires them in the mid-18th century, around the mid-18th century, and it has all the problems of the sources. So for Piedmont specifically, the only kind of significant difference is that they are more far away one from the other. There are more, I think there are around 100 and 110 kilometers between the Valley of Susa and the Vercellese plains. So they are more distant to the others, but at the same time, for northern Italy, truly peasant societies with wide commons and wide access to commons are more easily findable up towards the Alps than they are in the fertile Po Valley. In that case, commons have been eroded, and towards the 18th century they are fairly rare to find, and there are still some, but not. We are talking about two different orders of magnitude if we start to go up in altitude. So.
Then Mattia, but also some others about colonial products and how we count them. Did we count the number? Yes and no. For colonial products, yes. But for some other things, it's impossible because of the way probate inventories are structured. And so for a couple of things, they just huddle things together. But the good thing is that with luxuries, they don't. And so we do know, do they have 1, 2, or 3 coffee sets? And we did count them. For this paper, we just said, like, do they have them? Yes, no. That's for this analysis. We kept it like that, but we do have the numbers, so we can do the calculations. And what you can clearly see is that also there, if peasants indeed do own like a teapot and a coffee pot, often they don't have 4 or 5 of them. They maximum have 1 or 2. And so there is a difference there. So indeed, this is something that you can see that there is a difference, but not that big, because even the wealthiest elites don't have 10 of them. Then they have 3 rather than 2 or 1. It's not a huge difference, but we can count them, and in other papers we probably will go more in depth about that. Now, on why we did select colonial products also in Italy is because, of course, of the comparison. We want to compare all different products that we do for the Low Countries, also for Italy, even though that might make less sense for Italy. But in the papers that Alberto will write just about the Italian case, then there can be a little bit of a different approach, of course, and then you can have different perspective. But then how are you going
Yes, in the Italian part, of course, this was just, let's say, a snippet of our project, of the work so far done. But for the Italian part, for example, we have gone way more in detail also for the Low Countries one. Let's say a bit the approach, we divided them into macro categories. So, for example, what is furniture, and then furniture, each kind of object that you can find within the house, and also, of course, luxuries and colonial products. We have gone more into the details. For this paper, we just decided to remain into the macro category kind of aspect, and we just selected the more comparable ones. But I do appreciate the point of taking into consideration maybe those kind of material aspect that could represent a more luxurious item, more representative of luxuries in Italy and Piedmont than colonial products. Thinking also of access to this kind of products. Clearly the Low Countries have an advantage. They are facing the Northern Sea. Piedmont clearly is not. So yes, they may be taking into account other kind of materials, other kind of items as signifiers, equal signifiers, let's say, or comparable of colonial products, relatively speaking, could be indeed interesting for further analysis. We have collected the data, because then, of course, each object has been annotated as quantity, materiality, status whenever possible, and value of given at the time, whenever these were given, because probate inventories give the information that they carry. So, but we have collected the data, so it's something that we could reason and do something useful with. So, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Oh, there were multiple other questions that were not answered. I'm so sorry. I will speed it up.
You have a dialogue.
Yes. Katja, very, very good question about markets. Does it also apply for regions without that kind of hyper-connection to markets? I think Susa cannot be called a region with a hyper-connection to markets, but indeed it is integrated, and we have now a little bit been kind of debating it a bit. Yeah, how connected is it? So I think one of the main reasons why there is such a big difference between the Low Countries and the elements that we see in Italy might be about that connection to markets. And that's why it's also so interesting that we see trends are similar, but when it comes to pure absolute numbers and what do they actually own, then there is a difference. And one of the things that we're looking at for the Low Countries to explain that is the way they are connected to these markets. So even though they are a true peasant economy, they still are so ridiculously close to Antwerp and to to the Dutch cities, by the way, that they could actually, you can't separate them entirely. And that's, of course, is very interesting to see. And that's why I think that what you say might in the end be one of the key arguments to make to explain differences in that particular way. Can we push this back? Philip, can we push this back? No. My probate inventories with that kind of detail, they only start to appear in the 17th century, unfortunately. If we go back, we have some, but none that makes sense to do a quantitative analysis in this way, especially not for the rural regions, especially not for the peasant regions. It's impossible. So, unfortunately, no, we can't. Matteo, about the consumption baskets, we actually are doing that. Again, Alberto is already finished by doing that and is going to present this in another conference very soon, and he will talk about it, and I'm still working on it, but we're doing this indeed. I'm almost done, so what I can say is that pretty much when you look at these peasant economies, with achieving a respectable consumption basket, they score really well because they have these communal benefits. So when you see obtaining dairy products, obtaining fuel, obtaining food, even though their private property is almost nothing, you would, if you only take that, they would appear ridiculously poor. But when you then see what do they actually get, and without having to go via the market, they obtain 1.5, even 2 respectable consumption baskets because of all of that makeshift economy, communal activities, and that is something that is actually really interesting. But we didn't include it in the paper, but we are working on it, nearly finished. Alberto is finished, and this is something that especially will actually appear. Do you want to say something about that?
Super fast, because then I leave you to launch. For the thing of Susa, because I saw especially Professor Alfani making a very surprised face. Susa is an important commercial highway from Lyon to Turin, but in the 18th century starts to lose this kind of prerogative. So that's super fast. And about how we divided the social groups, we went by what was declared in documents that are sort of censuses ante litteram with many virgulettes, and then we link them to probate inventory. So if one is a notary, is a notable. If one is a peasant, is a peasant. If one is a woodworker, is a craftsman. This is the way we went. Who are the poor? The poor that I saw there are the miserable, the one defined as miserable in the sources, either inventory or in the things. Rice cultivation, of course, is fundamental for the development of the market-oriented economy of Vercelli. I would say is the most prominent cultivation that they have there, and that is connected with the rise of agricultural capitalism. And very finally, about the last comment we received, Professor Zuiderdam, if I pronounce it correctly with my broken Dutch. Yes, the fuel and food, in the case of fuel, for example, this is not only things found in the households, but it's also access to it in the sense of private ownership of woodland, in the case of Italy, and peatland, in the case of the Low Countries. And the argument that you want to make the security is a form of luxury. It can be declined in this way, but we were more interested in looking at security as something that goes side by side with luxury, keeping the definition, let's say, a bit more traditional, and focusing on security as important as luxury. In this case, they can be compared. Whether or not then they can be mixed in a more argumentative way, it's a nice perspective that we can look into. Thanks.
Yeah, also if I may add, because I thought what you said in the end was very interesting about, are they also luxuries? Because that's the thing, what often the literature by Jan de Vries and so on misses, is that a lot of people that invest in these luxuries sometimes do it to the detriment of actually obtaining decent food or fuel and so on and so on. So that's why we also wanted to look at it. And what you can clearly see is that, especially in these peasant regions, they do not do it to the detriment of obtaining, first of all, their basic necessities, but indeed, sometimes being able to invest in cattle, being able to invest in certain of these things, like abundant sources of food and fuel, could also be a kind of luxury. Having the luxury to stock up, having the luxury to be able to withstand shocks is sometimes also very important. And then 2 questions together, the populax and also the spoons and the cushions, because it is indeed, why did we choose the type of luxuries that we chose? Especially the majolica, I think, is one of these things. Almost nobody owns porcelain. I found one that had an entire porcelain set, but 15 pieces of porcelain even that they had, but that's it. The rural communities, most of them don't have entire porcelain sets, but they do invest in majolica, not to eat from, but to hang on the wall as a kind of replacement of what the real elites have. But spoons, indeed, in the cities, we know. There was this project by Bruno Blondet, and the people that studied probate inventories there also found a lot of silver spoons. They were also, at a certain point, obsessed by finding all these silver spoons. I haven't found one. Also not cushions. That's apparently not what they like. So that's not what they invest in. But what you clearly see is that they are mimicking. So if they can't buy a real painting, they buy a paper painting. If they can't buy real porcelain, then they buy Maiolica. If they can't buy a standing clock, then they have a smaller clock. So you can clearly see that they are going for the closest by kind of thing. So that's something that we can clearly see that is happening. Okay, I think then we all answered all the questions.
Thank you very much. So our session has come to an end. Let us thank all of our speakers once again for their fascinating papers, and let me thank the whole of the auditory for the great discussion in this morning. Now, enjoy your lunch, and we will see us again at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Many thanks and goodbye. Hartelijk bedankt. Dziękuję. It was my pleasure.
Thank you. Sorry for taking more time.
Pardon?
So sorry for taking more time.
No.